November 1967, the Central Highlands of South Vietnam, a remote region of jungle-covered mountains near the borders with Laos and Cambodia. Here, in some of the most difficult terrain in Vietnam, American and North Vietnamese forces would fight one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. The Battle of Dak To, or more accurately, the series of battles around Dak To, would last 22 days, involve thousands of troops on both sides, and result in casualties that shocked even a nation already numbed by years of war. This was not a battle for a strategic city or a vital piece of terrain. This was a battle of attrition, a brutal slugging match in the jungle where both sides traded lives for body counts, where soldiers fought and died for hills that would be abandoned as soon as the fighting ended. This is the story of the Battle of Dak To. It is a story of extraordinary courage under impossible conditions. It is a story of soldiers on both sides fighting in mountain jungles so dense that visibility was measured in feet, where resupply could only come by helicopter, where the wounded had to be lifted out by rope through triple canopy jungle because helicopters could not land. It is a story of mistakes and miscalculations, of commanders ordering attacks that had little strategic value, of men dying to take hills that their own side would abandon within days. And it is a story that captures the essential character of the American war in Vietnam in 1967. A war of attrition where success was measured in enemy bodies counted, where tactical victories led nowhere strategically, where courage and sacrifice were expended without achieving meaningful objectives. To understand the Battle of Dak To, we must first understand where it fits in the larger arc of the Vietnam War. By late 1967, the United States had been fighting in Vietnam with large-scale conventional forces for more than 2 years. Nearly 500,000 American troops were in country. They had fought major battles, had inflicted heavy casualties on Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, and had prevented the collapse of South Vietnam. But they had not won the war. The enemy, despite suffering enormous losses, continued to fight. They continued to infiltrate troops and supplies from North Vietnam down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They continued to launch attacks, to control territory, to recruit fighters. Victory seemed no closer in late 1967 than it had been in 1965. General William Westmoreland, the commander of American forces in Vietnam, pursued a strategy of attrition. His theory was that if American forces could kill enemy soldiers faster than North Vietnam could replace them, eventually the communists would reach a breaking point and would have to negotiate or give up. This strategy required finding and fixing enemy forces, then destroying them with superior American firepower. It meant conducting operations designed to draw the enemy into battle where American artillery and air power could be brought to bear. And it meant measuring success by body count, the number of enemy soldiers killed. The Central Highlands were crucial terrain in this strategy. The Highlands, a region of mountains and plateaus covered in dense jungle, ran along the western border of South Vietnam, adjacent to Laos and Cambodia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the North Vietnamese supply route, ran through Laos, but had numerous offshoots entering South Vietnam through the highlands. North Vietnamese army units infiltrated into South Vietnam through the highlands, establishing base areas from which they could launch operations. If the North Vietnamese could seize the highlands and cut across to the coast, they could split South Vietnam in two. So the highlands had to be defended. But defending the highlands was enormously difficult. The terrain was rugged and heavily forested, favoring defenders and making movement by large units almost impossible. There were few roads. Most areas were accessible only by helicopter or by foot along jungle trails. The weather was unpredictable, with sudden storms and low clouds that could ground aircraft for days. Resupply was difficult. Medical evacuation was dangerous. And the enemy, having fought in this terrain for years, knew it intimately and used it skillfully. The North Vietnamese strategy in the highlands was to draw American forces into battle in areas where American advantages in mobility and firepower were reduced. In the dense jungle and steep mountains, artillery was less effective because you could not see targets. Airstrikes were limited by weather and by the difficulty of identifying targets under triple canopy jungle. Helicopters were vulnerable to ground fire. The Americans' superior technology and firepower counted for less in this environment than in open terrain. And the North Vietnamese were willing to take heavy casualties to inflict losses on American forces. believing that American public opinion would eventually turn against the war if American casualties remained high. Dak To was a small special forces camp in Kon Tum province in the northern Central Highlands, very close to the borders with Laos and Cambodia. The camp was manned by a handful of American Special Forces soldiers and a few hundred Montagnard tribesmen who served as local defense forces. The camp controlled a small airstrip and served as a base for reconnaissance patrols into the surrounding mountains. The village of Dak To was tiny, just a collection of Montagnard houses near the camp. But the name Dak To would come to represent the entire series of battles fought in the surrounding area in October and November 1967. In October 1967, American intelligence detected signs of significant North Vietnamese activity in the mountains around Dak To. Radio intercepts, agent reports, and patrol contacts suggested that multiple North Vietnamese regiments were moving into the area. This was unusual. Typically, North Vietnamese forces operated in smaller units, avoiding concentration that would make them vulnerable to American firepower. But intelligence indicated that several regiments, perhaps an entire division, were gathering in the mountains west and southwest of Dak To. The North Vietnamese were indeed concentrating forces in the area. Their objective was to attack and overrun the Special Forces camps at Dak To and at Ben Het, another camp to the west. Taking these camps would give the North Vietnamese control of the border area and would threaten the provincial capital of Kon Tum. More importantly, from the North Vietnamese perspective, attacking these camps would draw American forces into battle in terrain that favored the defenders, where American casualties would be high. This was part of a broader North Vietnamese strategy of attacking American positions to inflict casualties and undermine American public support for the war. The American response was to move combat units into the Dak To area to defend the camps and to seek out and destroy the North Vietnamese forces. The 4th Infantry Division and the 173rd Airborne Brigade, known as the Sky Soldiers, were given the mission. These were experienced units that had been fighting in Vietnam for more than a year. They knew the enemy and the terrain. They knew this would not be easy, but they were confident that American firepower and tactics would prevail. The commander of the 173rd Airborne was Brigadier General Leo Schweider. He was an aggressive, confident officer who believed in taking the fight to the enemy. When intelligence indicated that North Vietnamese forces were in the mountains, Schweider ordered his battalions to conduct search and destroy operations, to find the enemy and engage them. His plan was to use helicopters to insert infantry companies onto high ground, to establish fire support bases from which artillery could cover operations, and to sweep the mountains looking for North Vietnamese units. The terrain made this extraordinarily difficult. The mountains around Dak To rose to heights of 3,000 feet or more. They were covered in double and triple canopy jungle, so thick that little sunlight reached the ground. Visibility was often measured in yards. Movement was slow and exhausting, climbing steep slopes through undergrowth, always aware that the enemy could be just yards away, and you would not see them until you were in contact. There were no clearings large enough for helicopter landing zones, except on the tops of some hills, and those hilltops often had to be blasted clear by bombs before helicopters could land. The soldiers who would fight at Dak To were mostly draftees, young men in their late teens and early 20s who had been sent to Vietnam, whether they wanted to go or not. They came from all over America, from cities and farms, from every background and region. Most had only a few months of training before being thrown into combat. They learned to be soldiers by surviving their first firefights. They learned to trust their buddies, to follow their sergeants and lieutenants, to do their jobs despite the fear that was always present. They were remarkably capable given their youth and limited training, but they were not professional soldiers in the way that World War II veterans had been. They were kids doing a job they had not chosen, in a war they did not fully understand, in a place that seemed like hell on earth. The North Vietnamese soldiers they would face were very different. Many were veterans who had been fighting for years. They were motivated by nationalism, by the belief that they were liberating their country from foreign domination. They were well trained in jungle warfare and in the tactics of fighting against a technologically superior enemy. They understood the terrain and used it to their advantage. They were also conscripts, many very young, and they too were scared. But they had discipline, they had experience, and they had a willingness to accept casualties that often shocked Americans. The first major engagement of the Dak To battles occurred on November 3rd, when a company from the 4th Infantry Division made contact with North Vietnamese forces on Hill 875, southwest of Dak To. The contact began with a few shots, then quickly escalated into a major firefight. The North Vietnamese were dug into bunkers and fighting positions on the hill. The American company was outnumbered and in danger of being overrun. They called for artillery and air support, and they called for reinforcements. The fighting on Hill 875 lasted all day. American artillery pounded the hill. Fighter bombers dropped napalm and high explosives. Helicopter gunships raked suspected enemy positions with rockets and machine gun fire. But the North Vietnamese stayed in their bunkers and kept fighting. They had learned that if they could endure the bombardment and stay close to American positions, the Americans would be more cautious about using artillery and airstrikes for fear of hitting their own troops. This tactic, called hugging the belt, was effective but required enormous courage and willingness to absorb casualties. Reinforcements were helicoptered in through heavy fire. The landing zones were hot, meaning helicopters were taking fire as they landed. Door gunners blazed away at the tree lines. Soldiers jumped out and ran for cover. Some were hit before they made it off the landing zone. The helicopters lifted off immediately, not waiting, because staying on the ground meant certain destruction. This scene would be repeated dozens of times during the Dak To battles, helicopters flying into fire to deliver troops or supplies, or to evacuate wounded. By the end of the day on November 3rd, the Americans held Hill 875, but at a cost. 20 American soldiers were killed and more than 30 wounded. North Vietnamese losses were estimated at much higher, but these estimates were based on observed artillery and airstrikes hitting suspected positions and on a few bodies found after the battle. The actual North Vietnamese casualties were unknown. They had withdrawn during the night, carrying their dead and wounded with them, as they always did. The hill, soaked in blood, would be abandoned by American forces within days. It had no strategic value, but taking it had demonstrated American determination and had supposedly killed North Vietnamese soldiers, which in the body count calculus was considered success. Over the next 2 weeks, similar engagements occurred throughout the area around Dak To. American units conducting patrols and sweeps would make contact with North Vietnamese forces. Firefights would erupt, often at close range in the jungle. Artillery and airstrikes would be called in. The battles would rage for hours or days. American forces would take the objective, count enemy bodies or estimate enemy casualties based on secondary indicators, and then move on to the next objective. The North Vietnamese would withdraw, regroup, and prepare for the next engagement. The pattern was frustrating for American commanders. They were winning these tactical engagements. They were killing more enemy soldiers than they were losing. But the North Vietnamese kept coming back. They seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of troops and a willingness to take losses that made no sense from a rational military perspective. What the Americans did not fully understand was that the North Vietnamese were fighting a political war as much as a military one. They believed that if they could inflict steady casualties on American forces, eventually the American public would demand withdrawal. From their perspective, trading lives was worth it if it advanced that goal. The fighting was brutal and exhausting for the American soldiers. They humped through the jungle carrying heavy loads, 60 or 70 pounds of equipment, ammunition, water, and rations. They climbed hills so steep they had to pull themselves up using trees and vines. They slept in the jungle at night, often in rain, always alert for enemy probes or attacks. They ate sea rations, canned food that was nutritious but monotonous and unappetizing. They dealt with leeches, mosquitoes, and the constant dampness that caused jungle rot, a fungal infection that ate away at skin. And they dealt with the knowledge that at any moment they could walk into an ambush or step on a mine or get hit by a sniper. The heat and humidity in the highlands were oppressive. Soldiers would be soaked with sweat within minutes of starting to move. They would drink water constantly and still be dehydrated. Heat exhaustion was common. Some soldiers collapsed and had to be evacuated. The weight of equipment and the exertion of moving through the jungle in the heat pushed men to their physical limits. And this was before they even made contact with the enemy. When contact was made, when the shooting started, the chaos was overwhelming. Bullets cracked through the air. Explosions from grenades and mortars shook the ground. Men screamed orders or cried out when hit. The noise was deafening. The confusion was total. In the thick jungle, you often could not see the enemy. You fired at muzzle flashes or at sounds. You had no idea how many enemy there were or where they all were. You just tried to survive, tried to do your job, tried to help your buddies. Training and discipline and the desire not to let down your comrades kept soldiers functioning despite the terror. The North Vietnamese tactics were to use the terrain and their prepared positions to negate American advantages. They would dig elaborate bunker complexes on hilltops or on the sides of hills. These bunkers were constructed from logs and covered with earth, camouflaged to blend into the jungle. They were nearly invisible until you were on top of them. They were strong enough to survive artillery hits and airstrikes, and they provided protected firing positions from which North Vietnamese soldiers could engage attacking Americans. When Americans attacked these positions, they faced a murderous crossfire. The North Vietnamese bunkers were positioned to cover all approaches with interlocking fields of fire. As Americans climbed toward a position, they would be hit from multiple directions. The only way to take these bunkers was to get close enough to destroy them with grenades or satchel charges, which meant soldiers had to expose themselves to enemy fire. This was incredibly dangerous and required extraordinary courage. Many Americans died or were wounded assaulting bunkers at Dak To. The use of artillery and air support was essential, but not always effective. In the dense jungle, it was hard to see targets. Forward observers would spot muzzle flashes or see movement and call in fire, but they were often guessing at enemy positions. Rounds would impact in the jungle, shredding trees, creating explosions. But whether they hit North Vietnamese soldiers in their bunkers was uncertain. Close air support by fighter bombers was limited by the need to avoid hitting friendly forces. If American and North Vietnamese positions were close together, as they often were, airstrikes could not be used for fear of friendly fire casualties. The most effective air support came from helicopter gunships and from high-flying B-52 bombers that carpet-bombed suspected North Vietnamese positions. The B-52 strikes, called arc light missions, were terrifying. The bombers flew so high they could not be heard. Suddenly, the jungle would erupt in a rolling wave of explosions as dozens of bombs impacted across a grid square. Everything in the target area would be destroyed. But the B-52s required precise coordinates and advanced warning. They were most useful against known base areas or troop concentrations, less useful in fast-moving engagements. Medical evacuation, called medevac or dust-off, was one of the great success stories of the Vietnam War. When soldiers were wounded, helicopters would fly into the jungle to pick them up and fly them to field hospitals within minutes. This rapid evacuation and treatment meant that the survival rate for wounded soldiers in Vietnam was higher than in any previous American war. If you survived long enough to get on a medevac helicopter, your chances of surviving your wounds were very good. The helicopter crews who flew these missions were among the bravest men in Vietnam, flying unarmed helicopters into hot landing zones to save wounded soldiers. But at Dak To, even medevac was difficult. Many areas had no landing zones. The jungle was too thick. Wounded had to be carried to clearings, which might be hundreds of yards away over difficult terrain, all while fighting was ongoing. Sometimes wounded had to be lifted out by rope through the jungle canopy, hoisted up through the trees to a hovering helicopter above. This was dangerous and painful for the wounded, but it saved lives. The medevac crews would risk anything to get a wounded soldier out. They would fly through fire, would land in impossible places, would hover over the jungle in a position that made them perfect targets. Many medevac crew members were killed or wounded rescuing others. The battles around Dak To intensified through early and mid-November. Multiple engagements occurred as American units swept through the mountains and made contact with North Vietnamese forces. But all of these earlier engagements were preludes to the main event, the battle that would define Dak To, in the minds of those who fought there and in the historical memory of the war. This was the battle for Hill 875, not the same Hill 875 where fighting had occurred earlier, but another hill in a different location with the same designation. This hill, southwest of Dak To, would become the scene of one of the bloodiest and most controversial battles of the entire war. Hill 875 rose to a height of nearly 3,000 feet. It was covered in jungle and had steep slopes on all sides. Intelligence indicated that North Vietnamese forces were using the hill as a base, that they had bunkers and supply caches there. The decision was made to assault the hill, to take it away from the North Vietnamese, and to destroy any enemy forces there. The mission was given to the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. This battalion, consisting of 4 infantry companies, would conduct a search and destroy operation on and around Hill 875. On November 19th, the battalion moved toward Hill 875. They had been helicoptered into landing zones in the area and were moving on foot through the jungle, heading toward the hill. The going was slow. The jungle was thick and the terrain steep. But there was no contact. The North Vietnamese were there, watching, waiting, but they did not engage as the Americans approached. They were preparing a trap. The battalion established a night defensive position on November 18th, forming a perimeter in the jungle. The next morning, November 19th, they continued toward the hill. A company, one of the 4 rifle companies in the battalion, was in the lead. They climbed toward the hilltop, moving cautiously, alert for any sign of the enemy. As they neared the crest of the hill, the North Vietnamese opened fire. The volume of fire was devastating. Multiple machine guns and rifles fired simultaneously into A Company. Soldiers were hit and went down. The company tried to return fire and to maneuver, but they were pinned down. They had walked into a prepared ambush site where the North Vietnamese had excellent fields of fire and protected positions. A company was in serious trouble, taking casualties, unable to advance or withdraw. The other companies in the battalion moved to support A Company. They tried to maneuver around the North Vietnamese positions, to attack from different directions, to relieve the pressure on A Company. But they too came under heavy fire. The entire battalion was now engaged with a large North Vietnamese force that was dug in and determined to hold the hill. What had been intended as a search and destroy operation had turned into a major battle for the hilltop. The fighting was close and brutal. In some places, American and North Vietnamese positions were separated by only yards. Soldiers threw grenades back and forth. Firefights were at point-blank range. The noise was incredible, a continuous roar of rifle and machine gun fire, explosions of grenades and mortars, the screams of wounded men. The jungle was shredded by the volume of fire. Trees were splintered, the ground was churned up, and men were dying. The battalion commander called for artillery support. Fire support bases in the area opened up, firing hundreds of rounds onto the hilltop. The shells screamed overhead and impacted with ear-splitting explosions. The artillery was danger close, meaning it was landing near friendly positions. Soldiers dug into the ground and prayed that the shells would not land short. Some did land short, killing and wounding American soldiers. But the artillery was necessary to have any chance of dislodging the North Vietnamese. Airstrikes were called in. Fighter bombers rolled in on the hilltop, dropping bombs and napalm. The napalm strikes were terrifying and spectacular, creating great billowing clouds of fire that consumed everything they touched. But even napalm had limited effect against North Vietnamese soldiers in deep bunkers. They could survive if they stayed in their bunkers until the fire burned itself out. And the thick jungle limited the effectiveness of the airstrikes. Bombs would explode in the trees, creating tremendous blasts, but much of the explosive force would be absorbed by the vegetation before reaching the ground. As the day wore on, the situation for the American battalion grew more desperate. They had taken heavy casualties and had not been able to take the hilltop. Ammunition was running low, water was running out. Wounded lay everywhere, being tended by medics who were themselves exhausted and often wounded. Medevac helicopters tried to get in to evacuate the wounded, but the landing zones were under fire. Several helicopters were hit and damaged. The wounded would have to wait. As darkness approached on November 19th, the battalion commander made the decision to consolidate his forces into a tight defensive perimeter and to wait for morning. They would dig in, hold what they had, evacuate the wounded during the night if possible, and prepare to resume the assault in the morning. The perimeter was small, only about 100 yards in diameter, formed on the side of the hill below the North Vietnamese positions. Soldiers dug foxholes and piled up logs and debris to provide some protection. They prepared for a long night. What happened next remains one of the most controversial incidents of the entire Dak To battle. In the early evening, as the Americans were establishing their defensive positions, An American Air Force fighter bomber making a strike on the hilltop released a bomb that fell short of the intended target. The bomb, a 500-pound high explosive, impacted directly in the middle of the American perimeter. The explosion was catastrophic. Dozens of American soldiers were killed instantly. Many more were wounded by the blast or by the shrapnel that sliced through the perimeter. Trees were shattered. Bodies and pieces of bodies were thrown through the air. The screams of the wounded filled the jungle. The short round, as it was called, had killed or wounded perhaps 100 American soldiers in an instant. It was a disaster, a friendly fire incident of the worst kind. Exactly what went wrong has never been fully explained. The pilot claimed he hit the target he was given. The forward air controller who directed the strike claimed the correct coordinates were provided. But something went terribly wrong, and American soldiers paid the price. In the confusion and chaos of combat, with fire missions being called in constantly, with coordinates being passed over radios in difficult conditions, mistakes happened. But this mistake had killed more Americans than the North Vietnamese had managed to kill that day. The battalion, already battered from a day of fighting, was now in even worse shape. The short round had killed or wounded a significant percentage of their remaining effective strength. The command structure was disrupted. Communications were difficult. Morale was shattered. The wounded were crying out for help, but there was little that could be done for them in the darkness. Medevac helicopters could not fly at night in that terrain. The wounded would have to endure until morning. The night of November 19th to 20th was one of the longest and worst nights that any of the survivors would ever experience. They lay in their holes, exhausted, scared, surrounded by wounded and dead comrades. They had no idea if the North Vietnamese would attack during the night. They had limited ammunition and water. They could hear the moans and cries of the wounded, and they knew that morning would bring either relief or another day of hell. The North Vietnamese did probe the perimeter during the night, testing for weak points, but they did not launch a major assault. They seemed content to hold their positions on the hilltop and to let the Americans suffer through the night. Their own casualties had been heavy, though the Americans did not know this. The North Vietnamese had fought bravely and effectively, but the artillery and airstrikes had taken a toll. They too were exhausted and depleted. Morning of November 20th brought renewed hope as helicopters began arriving to evacuate the wounded and to bring supplies. But the helicopters were again taking fire. Some were hit and damaged. Getting the wounded out was a slow and dangerous process, and the North Vietnamese were still on the hilltop, still in their bunkers, still ready to fight. The battle was not over. Reinforcements were on the way. Another battalion from the 173rd Airborne was helicoptered into the area to assist. Fresh troops, not yet bloodied, arrived ready to fight. The plan was to use these reinforcements to continue the assault on the hilltop, to finally dislodge the North Vietnamese and secure the hill. But this would take time to organize. The battalion that had been fighting needed time to rest, to be resupplied, to care for their wounded. The relief battalion needed to get oriented and to move into position. The fighting on November 20th was less intense than the day before, but still deadly. American forces conducted limited attacks to improve their positions and to keep pressure on the North Vietnamese. Artillery and airstrikes continued to pound the hilltop. Supplies and ammunition were brought in by helicopter. The wounded were gradually evacuated, though some of the most seriously wounded had to wait hours for their turn. The dead were also evacuated, their bodies placed in black plastic bags and loaded onto helicopters for transport to graves registration. Seeing their dead friends and comrades carried away was traumatic for the survivors. On November 21st, the assault on the hilltop resumed. Multiple companies from 2 battalions attacked from different directions. The plan was to overwhelm the North Vietnamese through weight of numbers and firepower. Artillery preparation fires pounded the hilltop for hours before the assault. Airstrikes hit suspected bunker locations. B-52s had been called in during the night and had carpet-bombed areas around the hill where North Vietnamese reinforcements or supply areas were suspected. Everything possible was being done to make the assault succeed. The American soldiers climbed toward the hilltop, moving through the shredded jungle, stepping over shell craters, finding bunkers that had been destroyed by artillery or airstrikes. But they also found bunkers that were still intact, still occupied, still fighting. As they neared the crest of the hill, the North Vietnamese opened fire again. The attack slowed. Soldiers took cover and returned fire. They called for supporting fires. They threw grenades at bunkers. They tried to maneuver closer to destroy the positions. Slowly, painfully, the Americans advanced. Small teams of soldiers would assault a bunker, one providing covering fire while another moved forward with grenades or a satchel charge. Many were hit doing this. The wounded would be pulled back, and others would take their place. It was grinding, exhausting, terrifying work. But gradually, bunker by bunker, the North Vietnamese positions were overrun. By afternoon of November 21st, American forces had taken the hilltop. The scene on the hilltop was one of total devastation. The jungle was gone, blasted away by the massive firepower that had been expended. The ground was torn up, covered in shell craters. Shattered bunkers were everywhere, many still containing North Vietnamese dead. Equipment and weapons were scattered about. The smell was terrible, a mix of explosive residue, blood, and death. American soldiers walked through this scene in a daze, hardly able to process what they had gone through to take this piece of ground. The body count from Hill 875 was presented as a great victory. Official figures claimed that over 400 North Vietnamese soldiers had been killed on and around the hill. American casualties were also heavy. 87 killed and more than 130 wounded in the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry alone, plus additional casualties in the relief battalions. But using the body count calculus, this was considered a favorable exchange. The Americans had killed far more enemy than they had lost. But what had been won? Hill 875 had no strategic value. It did not control any road or river. It was not a vital piece of terrain that opened up further operations. It was simply a hill in the jungle. Within weeks, American forces would withdraw from the hill, leaving it to the jungle and to the North Vietnamese if they wanted to return. The hill had been taken at great cost in American lives, and then it had been abandoned. The soldiers who had fought for it, who had seen their friends die for it, struggled to understand why. The controversy over the short round that had killed so many Americans on November 19th was never fully resolved. The Air Force investigated and concluded that it had been a tragic accident, a result of the confusion and difficulty of coordinating air, strikes in a fast-moving battle. But the soldiers who had been there, who had been hit by their own side's bomb, felt that someone should be held accountable. They felt that the safety measures that were supposed to prevent short rounds had failed. They felt that their suffering was not just from enemy action, but from their own military's mistakes. The psychological impact of the short round added to the trauma of the battle. Being wounded or killed by the enemy was something soldiers could understand and accept as part of war. But being killed by your own side, by a mistake, seemed pointless and enraging. Some survivors struggled with this for the rest of their lives, unable to fully process the injustice of dying from friendly fire. The incident became part of the dark mythology of Dak To, a symbol of how wrong things could go even when everyone was trying their best. The Battle of Dak To officially ended on November 22, 1967, though some combat operations in the area continued for a few more days. In the 22 days of fighting, American forces had engaged multiple North Vietnamese regiments in some of the most difficult terrain in Vietnam. They had fought dozens of separate engagements. They had called in thousands of artillery rounds and hundreds of airstrikes. They had used B-52 bombers to carpet bomb suspected enemy positions, and they had paid a heavy price. Official American casualties at Dak To were 289 killed, 985 wounded, and 18 missing. These were significant losses, particularly for the units most heavily engaged like the 173rd Airborne Brigade and elements of the 4th Infantry Division. Some companies had lost more than half their men killed or wounded. Some platoons had been almost wiped out. For the soldiers who fought at Dak To, the casualties were not statistics, but friends, buddies, leaders they had known and relied on. The losses were personal and devastating. North Vietnamese casualties were estimated at much higher numbers, as was typical in American body count reporting. Official figures claimed over 1,500 North Vietnamese killed at Dak To. These figures were based on bodies counted, on secondary indicators like blood trails and drag marks, and on estimates of casualties from artillery and airstrikes. As always, the actual North Vietnamese casualties were unknown because they carried away their dead and wounded. The North Vietnamese later acknowledged significant losses at Dak To, but their figures were much lower than American estimates. They admitted to several hundred killed, but claimed these losses were acceptable given the damage they had inflicted on American forces. The question of who won the Battle of Dak To has been debated ever since. By the metrics the American military used, Dak To was an American victory. More enemy had been killed than Americans. The North Vietnamese had been forced to withdraw from the area. The Special Forces camps at Dak To and Ben Hiet had not fallen. The North Vietnamese attempt to seize the border area had been defeated. These were all facts, and by the body count calculus that dominated American thinking, they constituted success. But by other measures, Dak To was less clearly a victory. The Americans had been drawn into a battle in terrain that favored the enemy, exactly what the North Vietnamese had wanted. The casualties inflicted on American units had been substantial, and the battles had received extensive media coverage in the United States, contributing to growing public concern about the war. The hills fought over had no lasting strategic value and were abandoned shortly after being taken. And the North Vietnamese forces, though battered, had not been destroyed. They would return to the area and would continue fighting. From this perspective, Dak To was at best a costly draw, at worst a strategic defeat disguised as a tactical victory. General Westmoreland proclaimed Dak to a great victory. He pointed to the body count figures and claimed that American forces had dealt a severe blow to the enemy. He used Dak To as evidence that his strategy of attrition was working, that American forces could find and destroy enemy units when they stood and fought. He argued that more operations like Dak To would eventually break the enemy's will and lead to victory. His optimism seemed justified by the numbers, but it was based on assumptions that were increasingly questionable. The soldiers who had fought at Dak To had more mixed feelings. They were proud of what they had accomplished, proud of their courage and their performance under terrible conditions. They had done their jobs, had fought bravely, had taken care of each other, but they also questioned whether the sacrifices had been worth it. They wondered why they had been asked to take hills that were then abandoned. They wondered how many more battles like Dak To they would have to fight before the war was won. Some were beginning to doubt that the war could be won at all. The media coverage of Dak To brought the battle to the attention of the American public. Reporters embedded with units at Dak To sent back dramatic accounts of the fighting. Peter Arnett of the Associated Press, who would later become one of the most famous war correspondents in the world, reported from Dak To and described the intensity of the combat. His dispatches made clear that this was not a small skirmish, but a major battle with heavy casualties. Television footage showed wounded soldiers being evacuated, exhausted troops moving through the jungle, and the devastation of the battlefield. Americans watching at home were shocked by the ferocity of the fighting and by the costs. The timing of Dak To was significant. The battle occurred in November 1967, just 2 months before the Tet Offensive of January and February 1968. Tet would be the turning point of the war, the moment when American public opinion decisively turned against the conflict. But Dak To was part of the build-up to the turning point. Each battle, each casualty report, each story of American soldiers fighting and dying in remote jungles for hills that were then abandoned eroded public confidence in the war effort. Dak To contributed to the sense that the war was not being won, despite official claims of progress. The North Vietnamese perspective on Dak To was different from the American perspective. They saw the battle as successful in drawing American forces into costly combat in unfavorable terrain. They had inflicted significant casualties on elite American units. They had held their positions for days against overwhelming firepower. And they had demonstrated their willingness to accept heavy losses to achieve their objectives. From their strategic perspective, which was focused on breaking American will rather than on holding territory, Dak To was a success. They believed that each American casualty brought them closer to victory by eroding American public support for the war. This fundamental difference in strategic perspective helps explain why both sides could claim victory at Dak To. The Americans measured success in enemy killed and terrain taken. The North Vietnamese measured success in American casualties inflicted and American will weakened. These different metrics meant that both sides could look at the same battle and draw opposite conclusions. This divergence in how success was measured was one of the key problems with American strategy. The Americans were playing a game of chess while the North Vietnamese were playing a game of Go. They were fighting different wars with different rules and different objectives. The physical wounds suffered at Dak To were treated and most healed, though many soldiers carried scars for the rest of their lives. But the psychological wounds were less visible and often more lasting. Many soldiers who fought at Dak To developed what is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about the battle. They had flashbacks triggered by sounds or smells. They struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they had lived when friends had died. They had difficulty adjusting to normal life back in the United States. For some, the trauma of Dak To was something they carried for decades, affecting their relationships, their careers, and their mental health. The treatment available for psychological trauma in the late 1960s and early 70s was limited. PTSD was not officially recognized as a diagnosis until 1980. Before then, psychological problems among veterans were often dismissed as weakness, or were attributed to other causes. Veterans who struggled after returning from Vietnam often received little help and less understanding. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to numb the pain. Some became isolated and withdrawn. Some had angry outbursts or violent episodes. The psychological costs of battles like Dak To would only be fully recognized years later, long after the physical wounds had healed. The veterans of Dak To formed bonds that lasted lifetimes, men who had fought together, who had saved each other's lives, who had endured hell together, maintained contact for years after the war. They attended reunions. They kept in touch through letters and phone calls, and later through email and social media. They were the only ones who truly understood what they had been through. Their families could not fully comprehend it. Their civilian friends could not relate, but their fellow veterans understood. This brotherhood, forged in combat, was one of the few positive things to come out of the experience of Dak To. The tactical lessons of Dak To were studied by the military and incorporated into training and doctrine. The importance of reconnaissance and intelligence before committing to battle was emphasized. The need for better coordination of air and artillery support was recognized. The vulnerability of concentrated forces to enemy fire in close terrain was acknowledged. Techniques for assaulting fortified positions were refined. These lessons would be applied in subsequent operations in Vietnam and would influence American military thinking for years to come. But the broader strategic lessons of Dak To were not learned, or at least not applied. The fundamental problem with the strategy of attrition, that it assumed the enemy would eventually reach a breaking point and give up, was not re-examined. The assumption that American firepower could compensate for other weaknesses was not questioned. The strategy continued essentially unchanged until the Tet Offensive forced a reconsideration. Even then, the changes were more about how the war was fought than about whether it could or should be won. The role of the terrain at Dak To in shaping the battle cannot be overstated. The jungle-covered mountains were unlike anything most American soldiers had experienced. The difficulty of movement, of visibility, of coordination, all were magnified by the terrain. The advantage usually enjoyed by American forces in mobility and firepower was reduced. The North Vietnamese, who knew the terrain and had prepared it for defense, held significant advantages. Fighting in such terrain was always going to be costly for the attacker, regardless of firepower advantages. This raised questions about whether American forces should have been fighting in the Central Highlands at all. The terrain favored the defender and negated many American advantages. The areas being fought over had little strategic value beyond denying them to the enemy, and the enemy could simply wait until American forces left, and then return. Some critics argued that the United States should have focused on defending populated areas and key infrastructure, rather than pursuing the enemy into remote mountains. But this would have meant giving up on the strategy of attrition, which was the foundation of Westmoreland's approach to the war. The Montagnard people who lived in the Central Highlands paid a heavy price for the war being fought in their homeland. Their villages were destroyed in the fighting, or by American bombing. Their traditional way of life was disrupted. Many were forced to flee to refugee camps. The mountains they had inhabited for centuries became a free fire zone, where anything that moved could be targeted. Some Montagnards fought alongside American forces, serving as scouts and guides. Others tried to remain neutral, but were caught between the warring sides. After the war ended and the Communists won, the Montagnards who had helped the Americans faced persecution, and many fled as refugees. The environmental damage caused by the fighting at Dak To and in the Central Highlands more broadly was severe. The jungle was destroyed by bombing, artillery, and the use of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange. Hillsides were stripped bare, craters scarred the landscape. The ecosystem was fundamentally altered. While nature has recovered to some extent in the decades since the war ended, the damage was enormous and in some areas permanent. The unexploded ordnance left behind continues to pose a danger today, killing and injuring people who encounter bombs and shells that failed to explode during the war. The cost of the Battle of Dak To in material terms was staggering. Thousands of artillery shells were fired, each costing hundreds of dollars. Hundreds of bombs were dropped, some costing thousands of dollars each. B-52 missions cost tens of thousands of dollars per sortie. Helicopters were damaged or destroyed, each worth hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. The total cost of the 3-week battle ran into tens of millions of dollars. And what did this money buy? A few hills in the jungle that were abandoned within weeks, and some enemy casualties of uncertain number. From a cost-benefit perspective, Dak To was a poor investment. But war cannot be evaluated purely in monetary terms. The real costs were measured in lives lost and bodies broken, in families receiving telegrams informing them that their sons or husbands or brothers would not be coming home. Each American death at Dak To was a tragedy for a family somewhere in the United States. Each wound was a life altered forever. And while American casualties received attention and sympathy, the Vietnamese casualties, both North Vietnamese soldiers and civilian montagnards, represented equally real human suffering that often went unacknowledged in American accounts of the battle. The question of why American soldiers fought so bravely at Dak To, despite the questionable strategic value of the battle, is worth considering. They fought for each other, for their buddies, for the men in their unit. They fought because they were ordered to, and because they had been trained to follow orders. They fought because they did not want to let down their comrades or to appear cowardly. They fought because once engaged in combat, survival often depends on fighting effectively. These motivations sustained soldiers through battles that they might have questioned if they had stopped to think about the larger picture. The leadership at various levels at Dak To has been both praised and criticized. At the small unit level, squad leaders, platoon leaders, and company commanders generally performed well under extraordinarily difficult conditions. They led from the front. They took care of their men. They made good tactical decisions in the chaos of combat. Many were killed or wounded doing their jobs. At higher levels, the leadership is more questionable. The decision to assault Hill 875, the coordination of fires, the handling of the short round incident, all have been criticized. Some have argued that senior officers were too focused on body counts and not focused enough on the welfare of their troops, or on whether the objectives were worth the cost. The role of air power at Dak To demonstrated both its capabilities and its limitations. American air power was devastating when properly employed. Fighter bombers, helicopter gunships, and B-52s could deliver enormous amounts of ordnance with precision and power, but air power alone could not win battles. It could not take and hold ground. It could not locate an enemy that was well camouflaged and dug in. And it was limited by weather, by terrain, by the need to avoid friendly fire. At Dak To, air power was essential, but not sufficient. Ground forces still had to close with the enemy and destroy them in brutal close combat. The helicopter was the symbol of American mobility and technological superiority in Vietnam. But Dak To showed its vulnerabilities as well as its capabilities. Helicopters allowed American forces to move rapidly, to insert troops into areas that could not be reached otherwise, to evacuate wounded quickly. But helicopters were vulnerable to ground fire, particularly in the confined mountain valleys around Dak To. Many helicopters were damaged at Dak To. Some were shot down. Pilots and crew members were killed or wounded. The losses demonstrated that helicopters were not invulnerable and that the enemy had learned to fight against them effectively. The comparison between Dak To and other famous battles of the Vietnam War is instructive. Dak To was similar to battles like Hamburger Hill and Khe Sanh in that it involved intense fighting in remote, difficult terrain for objectives of questionable strategic value. These battles were characterized by high casualties, by the use of massive firepower, and by the eventual abandonment of the positions fought over. They represented the American approach to the war, find the enemy, fix them in place, and destroy them with firepower. This approach had tactical success, but did not lead to strategic victory. Dak To was different from battles like the Tet, offensive or the Easter Offensive, in that it was not part of a coordinated enemy campaign with clear strategic objectives. It was more of a meeting engagement, where both sides maneuvered into the same area and ended up fighting for control. The North Vietnamese wanted to attack the Special Forces camps and to draw American forces into battle. The Americans wanted to find and destroy North Vietnamese forces. Both sides got what they wanted in some sense, but neither achieved decisive results. The impact of Dak To on the course of the war was modest, but real. It did not change the strategic situation significantly. The war continued along the same trajectory it had been following, but Dak To contributed to the cumulative effect of multiple battles, multiple casualties, multiple stories of fighting for objectives that were then abandoned. This cumulative effect eroded American public support for the war and set the stage for the shock of the Tet Offensive 2 months later. When Tet came, when the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, the American public was already primed to be skeptical of official claims about progress. Dak To had been presented as a great victory, yet more Americans had died, and nothing seemed to have changed. The enemy was still able to launch major operations. The war seemed no closer to ending. When Tet showed that the enemy could strike everywhere, including the American embassy in Saigon, the credibility of official optimism was shattered. Dak To had contributed to the credibility gap that Tet exposed so dramatically. The soldiers who fought at Dak To returned home to a country that was increasingly divided about the war. Some were welcomed as heroes by those who supported the war effort. Others faced indifference or even hostility from those who opposed the war. Many found it difficult to talk about their experiences. How could they explain what they had been through to people who had not been there? How could they convey the intensity of combat, the fear, the loss, the confusion about why they were fighting? Many simply stopped trying and kept their experiences to themselves. The legacy of Dak To in military culture and in veteran culture is complex. For those who fought there, it remains a defining experience of their lives. They measure time as before Dak To and after Dak To. They remember the specific hills, the specific firefights, the specific moments of terror and courage. They remember their friends who did not come home. For the broader military, Dak To is one of many battles, studied for its tactical lessons but not holding special significance. For the American public, Dak To is largely forgotten, overshadowed by better-known battles and by the overall narrative of the war. The question of what the soldiers who died at Dak To died for remains painful and unresolved. Did they die defending South Vietnam from communist aggression? Did they die for a corrupt and unpopular government that most South Vietnamese did not support? Did they die because their leaders pursued a flawed strategy? Did they die for nothing? These questions cannot be answered definitively. Different people draw different conclusions based on their perspectives on the war. But for the families of those who died, the questions are agonizing and personal. The survivors of Dak To have spent decades processing their experiences. Some have written memoirs or given interviews, trying to make sense of what they went through, and to ensure that the sacrifices are remembered. Others have preferred to remain silent, keeping their memories private. Many have struggled with the question of meaning, trying to find some purpose or lesson in the suffering they endured and witnessed. For some, the meaning is found in the bonds of brotherhood, in having served with honor, in having done their duty. For others, the meaning remains elusive. The historical assessment of Dak To has evolved over time. Immediately after the battle, it was presented as a clear American victory. Over the following years, as the war turned against the United States, and as the strategy of attrition was widely criticized, Dak To came to be seen as emblematic of the problems with American strategy. More recently, military historians have taken a more nuanced view, recognizing both the tactical effectiveness of American forces and the strategic limitations of the approach. Dak To is now understood as a complex battle that cannot be reduced to simple judgments of victory or defeat. The physical landscape of Dak To has changed in the decades since the battle. The jungle has regrown over the scarred hillsides. The bunkers and foxholes have filled in or collapsed. The bomb craters are covered with vegetation. Nature has healed the visible wounds. though unexploded ordnance remains beneath the surface. The Special Forces camp at Dak To is long gone. The area is now part of peaceful rural Vietnam, where farmers work the land and life goes on far removed from the memories of battle. But for those who were there in November 1967, Dak To remains vivid in memory. They can still hear the sounds of battle, the crack of rifle fire, the explosions of artillery, the screams of the wounded. They can still smell the jungle, the cordite, the blood. They can still feel the fear, the exhaustion, the grief. These memories do not fade with time for many veterans. They remain fresh and immediate, even decades later. This is the enduring reality of combat trauma, that the war does not end when the shooting stops. The lessons of Dak. To extend beyond the military sphere, the battle raises questions about how democracies wage war, about the relationship between military strategy and political objectives, about the costs of war measured in human terms, rather than in body counts or terrain taken. It raises questions about leadership, about the obligations that leaders have to those they send into combat, about whether those obligations were fulfilled at Dak To. And it raises questions about how wars are remembered and commemorated, about whose stories are told and whose are forgotten. For the next generation of American military leaders, many of whom fought in Vietnam as junior officers or enlisted soldiers, the lessons of battles like Dak To were formative. They resolved to fight future wars differently, to avoid the mistakes of Vietnam, to pursue strategies that had clear objectives and realistic chances of success. This determination shaped American military doctrine and operations in the Gulf War, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Whether the lessons were correctly understood and properly applied is debatable, but there is no question that Vietnam, including battles like Dak To, profoundly influenced how the American military approached subsequent conflicts. The relationship between the military and American society was also shaped by Vietnam and by battles like Dak To. The experience of being sent to fight in an unpopular war, of serving with honor only to return to indifference or hostility, affected how veterans related to civilian society and how civilians related to veterans. The determination to honor and support veterans, to not repeat the mistakes of how Vietnam veterans were treated, became a priority in subsequent conflicts. This was a direct response to the Vietnam experience, an attempt to separate support for troops from support for the wars they fought. The documentation of Dak To, through military records, through journalistic accounts, through veteran memoirs, through oral histories, provides a detailed picture of what the battle was like. This documentation serves multiple purposes. It preserves the memory of those who fought and died. It provides material for historians studying the war. It offers lessons for military professionals. And it tells a human story of courage and suffering that deserves to be remembered even when the strategic and political context is debated. The Battle of Dak To, viewed from the perspective of more than 50 years, stands as a symbol of the American war in Vietnam in 1967. It captures the courage of American soldiers fighting under terrible conditions. It demonstrates the tactical proficiency of American forces and their ability to bring massive firepower to bear. But it also reveals the strategic limitations of the attrition strategy, the questionable value of the objectives being fought for, and the costs measured in lives and suffering. Dak To was not a turning point in the war. It did not change the course of events, but it was characteristic of how the war was being fought and why that approach would ultimately fail. The final accounting of Dak To cannot be rendered solely in terms of casualties or territory. The battle must be understood in human terms, as an experience that marked everyone who participated in it. For the Americans who fought there, Dak To was a crucible that tested them in ways they had never imagined. Many rose to that test, fighting bravely, caring for their comrades, doing their duty despite fear and exhaustion. Some did not survive the test. They gave their lives on jungle hillsides far from home, for reasons that even now remain subject to debate. Their sacrifice was real and should be honored, even as we question the decisions that placed them in that situation. For the North Vietnamese who fought at Dak To, the battle was part of a larger struggle for national reunification and independence that they had been waging for decades. They fought with determination and courage, accepting heavy casualties to achieve their objectives. From their perspective, which would eventually be vindicated by history, Dak To was one battle in a war they would ultimately win. Their sacrifices, like those of their American enemies, were real and were made in service of beliefs they held deeply. For the Montagnard people of the Central Highlands, Dak To was another chapter in a story of suffering and displacement caused by a war fought in their homeland by outsiders. They had no say in the decisions that brought armies to their mountains. They paid a price for a conflict that was not of their making. Their story is often forgotten in accounts of the battle, but it is part of the full human cost of Dak To. The Battle of Dak To reminds us that war is not an abstraction, not a matter of statistics or strategy, but a human experience of suffering, courage, fear, and loss. The battles fought in the jungles of Vietnam more than half a century ago were experienced by real people whose lives were forever changed by what they endured. Understanding their experiences, honoring their sacrifices, and learning from their stories is how we give meaning to the suffering of war and how we work to prevent such suffering in the future. This is the ultimate lesson of Dak To, a lesson that transcends debates about strategy or politics and speaks to the fundamental human costs of war.